in not only criminal offending, but victimization as well. And so this week we'll be talking about what are some of the most common types of crime, very generally talking about the most common types of crime that people are arrested for in the United States. We'll also look at racial and ethnic involvement in criminal offending and ask this question about whether or not races or different minority groups are more likely to be involved in certain crimes or be arrested for certain offenses. We'll also be looking at long-term trends in victimization and offending to see whether or not over time are we seeing increases or decreases in criminal offending. And then finally, we'll be talking about the three main types of crime data programs. So we have the UCR, the NCBS, and self-report surveys. And basically asking the question about how those different data systems, how they vary in terms of recording race and ethnicity. So in terms of collecting data on crime, so collecting data on crime, probably the earliest states to collect crime data were in the early 1800s. New York, Massachusetts were some of those states that collected data on crime and prison statistics. But the first federal agency or federal mandate to collect crime in the United States occurred in 1870. And it was done by the U.S. Census Bureau. All right, most of us, right, we're familiar with the decennial census, that survey that comes out every 10 years that tries to account for how many people are living in the U.S., right, every 10 years. And so in 1870, that was the first year that on the federal level, we collected data on crime. So to show you what that looks like, early crime statistics, there was no data collected on lynching, right? We collected data on number of prisoners across the U.S., number of arrests for various crimes, things like that. But we never collected any data on lynching. So to kind of fill that gap, to fill that void, the Chicago Tribune newspaper collected data on lynching. And from 1874 to about 1901, they recorded approximately 5,000 lynchings that occurred in the U.S. during that time period. 1874 to 1901, approximately 5,000 lynchings. Now, with that data, approximately 80% or 4,000 of those, the victims of those lynching incidents were African American. But the other 1,000 was often made up of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, as well as some Asians. And for those groups, a lot of the lynchings occurred along the U.S.-Mexico border, mainly Texas, up to California. So the majority of those lynchings occurred or victimized African Americans, but there was other groups that were also lynched during that time period. Now, ironically, right, back then, we didn't have any data on lynching statistics, so we had the newspaper, Chicago Tribune specifically, collect that information. And today we kind of face a similar issue, not with lynchings, but with another crime type that's very widely discussed. And that's with police officer-involved shootings. So with police officer-involved shootings, we really don't have any accurate data on the number of those shootings that occur every year, whether they're legal or not justified. We don't have any data for that. So who fills the void? More or other newspaper companies do that same thing. So we have newspapers like the Washington Post or the Guardian that up till today now collect data on police officer involved shootings because we don't get an accurate and reliable information on that from police departments themselves. Some will report it. Some will report it to the UCR, for example, but most choose not. So when we're talking about race and crime, some points here is that the majority of us will probably never have any direct contact with the criminal justice system, right? Very few of us, maybe none of us, hopefully none of us, will ever be arrested or victimized. And when we look at arrest trends by race, we see that percentage-wise, we're not talking about rates yet, but percentage-wise, for non-fatal violent crimes, so non-fatal violent crimes is going to include violent crimes like sexual assault, aggravated assault, and robbery. So we're excluding homicide here. The majority of those arrested for those crimes are going to be whites. But whites make up 60% of the U.S. population, followed by blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans and Asians. Right? So there's variation overall in arrest for these non-fatal violent crimes across racial and ethnic. And despite what we see on TV, violent crimes are not the norm. I think that's something probably most of you know. That violent crimes are not the norm. Majority of people are often arrested either for drug or property offenses or some other public order offenses, such as public drunkenness or disorderly conduct. Right? So statistically speaking, when we're talking about arrests, violent crimes make up a very small percentage of total arrests. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about 3 crime data tools that we use to measure not just crime, but rate and crime as well. And a lot of this is information for many of you it's going to be reviewed. So we're talking about the first one, Uniform Crime Reporting Program, or UCR for short. Most people regard this as an official statistics, right? So when people say official statistics, they're often talking about the UCR. And the UCR, the program itself is no longer around. It was shut down in 2020. But it's been around for nearly a century before that, right? 1930, when it first began collecting data across the US. And the UCR itself, what we're going to primarily focus on for this class is just those crimes reported to the police, right? So majority of UCR data focuses on those crimes reported to the police, but they also have data on the percentage of crimes that have been cleared, right, where an arrest has been made. They also have some data on the arrestees, and it also includes data on law enforcement personnel, right? So as I mentioned earlier, some police departments will send their police officer involved shooting data to the UCR, but not everyone does it because it's purely voluntary. When we're talking about crimes reported to the police, approximately 95% of police agencies across the U.S. participated or sent the UCR crime data. So the UCR itself, at least in regard to crimes reported to the police, was very well recorded in the UCR. So about crimes reported to the police. The FBI, who heads the UCR, is interested in 8 primary index offenses. Okay. So I'm going to go over these in case you may have forgotten. The first one's going to be murder or homicide, followed by rape or sexual assault, then robbery, and then aggravated assault. So it's murder, homicide, followed by rape, sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault. So those 4 crimes there are known as the violent crime index. So when people talk about violent crime rates, right, especially violent crime rates across cities, they're usually talking about those 4 crimes. The next crimes for the property crime index are going to be burglary, theft or larceny, motor vehicle theft, and then arson. So you have burglary, theft, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Right? Those other 4 crimes, as I mentioned, make up the property crime index. So collectively, those 8 crimes that are reported to the police is what the UCR is predominantly interested in. Right? Yes, they'll accept data on other types of crime, but when they publish reports like Crime in America, they're usually focused on these 8 primary index offenses. They also collect additional data on homicides. So in regards to crimes reported to the police, all they're interested in primarily is how many times they occur in the U.S. But with the exception of homicide and murder, they want some additional information. And every year, prior to 2020, what was published was the Supplemental Homicide Reports, or SHR. And this is what it looks like. Right? So for homicides that are reported to the police, if they have this information, they want to know it. So for example, they want to know the age, gender, race, and ethnicity of both the victim and the offender if an arrest was made. They also want to know how that person died. Was it with a firearm? Was it with a hammer or some other object? What is the relationship between the offender and the victim, if it's known? And a brief description of how the homicide or murder occurred, right? What are the circumstances involving that incident? So for murders specifically, UCR wants this additional information if it's available. So when we're looking at the UTR, and we're looking at those crimes where an arrest has been made, we can see that, at least for whites are going to be overrepresented in arson. When I say overrepresented, what I mean is that whites make up about 60% of the U.S. population, but 71% of arson cases or arson arrests. And DUI is not an index crime, but for DUI specifically, 82% of those arrests are of a white individual. And then for the next one, African Americans are overrepresented in both homicide and robbery. Hispanics and Latinos for rape and aggravated assault. So African Americans make up about 13% of the population, but half of arrests for murder and robbery. For Latinos, 18% of the population, but nearly 30% of arrests for rape and aggravated assault. And Native Americans, much smaller percentage of the population, 1 to 2% of the population, but 8% of arrests for public drunkenness. And Asians make up 6% of the U.S. population, but 11% of arrests for gambling. So variation in crimes overall by not just race, but the offense type. as well. So data from the supplemental homicide report, right? As I mentioned earlier, UCR collects additional data on homicide specifically. And what we know based on supplemental homicide reports is that overwhelmingly, most of the victims of a homicide are males. Most homicides are also intra-racial, where whites murder other whites, blacks murder other blacks, and Hispanics murder other Hispanics. Right, so the majority of homicides are interracial, and very few, just a small fraction of those homicides are regarded as stranger homicides. Right, only less than 10% of homicides are stranger homicides. So what that means is that most homicide, there's some established connection or relationship between the offender and the victim. And homicides, relative to other crime types, can be a little easier to solve, right? Because we know that in most instances, there's some established relationship. It's when the crime appears to be random, or maybe the work of, say, a serial killer, where trying to solve those types of crimes becomes more difficult, right? Because usually when you're a police detective, especially a homicide detective, you find someone who's been murdered, you want to ask the question is, okay, who's this person been talking to recently? Did they have any problems with anyone? Right? So homicides are usually pretty easy to solve, with the exception of those cases that are regarded as stranger homicides. And in the US, homicides overall have been going down. They've been declining, especially since 1993. There was an increase in 2020, a very high and notable increase in 2020. But for the most part, over time, we've seen homicides go down. Drawbacks of the UCR. Again, right, for many of you, this information should be with you. So the biggest drawback is that for whatever reason, for some crimes, they're just not reported to the police. Whether because we think that crime is not important, whether we think it's not our business, whether we don't want to get the offender in trouble, whatever the reason, some crimes are just not reported to the police. So also, for some types of crime, for some offenses, police have discretion, right? Police have authority of whether or not they want to make arrests in certain crimes, mainly low-level offenses. And so one example is for drugs, right? In some cases, for drug use or drug possession, police can use their discretion and possibly selectively enforce the law against certain people, against certain racial groups. And when that happens, you might see variations in arrests by race, or maybe African Americans or Hispanics are more likely to be arrested for drug offenses because of selective enforcement of the law. The next one is called the hierarchy rule. So one of the issues that plagued the UCR historically is that for any crime incident, there's often multiple crimes or offenses that are committed. So one example is that if someone is robbing another person and they're robbing them with a handgun, and for whatever reason they discharge their handgun and they shoot and kill the victim. In that specific incident, there's been a robbery and then there's been a homicide. But the hierarchy rule says that only the most serious crime is counted in any one incident. And so for that one incident, only the homicide would be counted and the robbery would be excluded from crime counts. There's also been changes in the definition of rape over time. So up until 2012, the UCR only regarded rape as incidents involving a man raping a woman, right? So any incidents where it was a male raping another male, or a female raping another female, or vice versa, female raping a man, those incidents were not counted as rape in the UCR. Just those incidents of males raping females. That's no longer the case today, right? Since 2013, the UCR, right before it went offline, changed the definition of rape, where now they recognize, offenders and victims could be of both genders. So in regards to race, how race has been recorded in the UCR. Several changes over time. I think I mentioned this last week, but when the UCR was first carried out or invented in 1930, we only had 3 categories. We had whites, we had blacks, and then we had other. But today, or right before it went offline, the UCR recognized 6 racial categories. I don't have to know what those 6 are, but there was just an increase or greater number of racial categories that are recognized over time. And also, as we mentioned in one of the previous slides, how police agencies define or record race and ethnicity is going to matter across places, across agencies. And then in 2013, that's when the UCR included its definition for ethnicity, or included a separate category for ethnicity. So prior to 2013, most Latinos, because most Latinos identify as white for their race, were included in the white racial category. So before 2013, you couldn't get any data on Latino arrests specifically. So, as I was saying, in 2020, we shut the UCR program down. And part of that was because we recognized their limitations, right? We knew that the UCR wasn't a perfect system. The FBI knew that. And so what we go with now, in place of the UCR, is NIBRS, which stands for the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Right, National Incident-Based Reporting System. And NIBRS has actually been around for a very, very long time, right? Since 1988. And so briefly speaking, right, whereas UCR is primarily interested in collecting data on 8 index offenses, NIBRS collects data on 46 different crime types. And we're talking about crimes reported to the police. Right, so much larger expansion of crimes or crime data that are collected under the NIBRS system relative to the UCR. Also important, there's no hierarchy rule. No hierarchy rule. Right? So regardless of how many crimes occur in any one incident, NIBRS is going to collect data on all those offenses. So in regards to collecting crime data itself, NIBRS is far more representative, far more inclusive than the UCR. The drawback as of right now is that very few departments, there's still a handful of departments that haven't yet adopted the system. Right? So during its peak, UCR had about 95% participation rate. Currently, the NIBRS system has 77% participation rate across agencies. It improves every year. It's getting better and better, but it's still not at the same threshold as UCR was during its time. But still, the NIBRS system represents a very notable improvement over the UCR. The only difficult part from a research standpoint is the NIBRS system is a little bit difficult to work with. Not just for researchers, but agencies themselves, right? How to record or send information to the NIBRS system is pretty difficult, and that's why the population coverage is fairly low. So when we're talking about the UCR itself, right, because many crimes are either not reported to the police or for reasons like the hierarchy rule, a lot of crimes don't get reported. So anytime we see data from the UCR, how we should interpret it is that it's an underrepresentation. With the exception of maybe homicide, the crime figures we see for robbery, for rape, and sexual assault are likely an undercount. So, given those issues, another way we collect data on crime is through victimization surveys. So, whereas UCR is focused on just those crimes reported to the police, victimization surveys are interested in victimizations that people have experienced over the course of their life or in the past 6 months, for example. So victimization survey focuses on incidents or victimizations that have occurred to individuals. Now, when we're talking about victimization surveys, we typically think of the NCBS, which has been around since about 1972. And in 1992, it took the name the National Crime Victimization Survey. So the NCBS is regarded as a household survey. And here's what I mean by that. So whenever we send out surveys, typically we send them out to specific people or individuals, right? With the NCBS, actually they send out surveys to residential addresses. So instead of surveying people directly or sampling people directly, they sample household or residential addresses. And so if your address is selected for the NCBS, everyone in the household 12 years and up is asked to participate. Right? You don't have to, it's purely voluntary. But if you're selected, they ask people 12 years and over living in the household be interviewed. And whereas UCR is interested in the age index crimes, NCBS focuses on non-fatal victimizations. So I mentioned previously that can include rape and sexual assault, as well as aggravated assault and robbery, but it excludes homicide. And then also property crimes or household victimization, things like burglary or theft. But the NCBS itself does a much better job than the UCR at getting at the number of crimes that occur in the United States each year. Right? So when we're talking about data and information obtained, NCBS is much better than the UCR. This is what the questionnaire looks like. Won't spend too much time on it. But here's some data obtained from the NCBS, especially in regards to race and ethnicity. So in regards to victimization, right, not arrest, but victimization, what we find in terms of looking at race or differences in the population, we see that Native American and people who identify as two or more races have higher rates of victimization. So the NCBS, at least in regards to victimization and race and ethnicity, tell a slightly different story. At least when we're talking about victimizations, especially non-fatal victimizations, the highest rates is for Native American and those of two or more races. So one interesting point to talk about here is the amount of crime that Native American females especially experience, right? Their odds of being violently victimized, either through sexual violence, domestic violence, is very, very high, right? Much higher than that of other groups, especially other minorities. So I want to play a video talking about Native American victimization. Active friends along the search and rescue teams have been looking for Selena Not Afraid in about a 3 to 5 mile radius.
Selena Not Afraid was last seen around 2 o'clock on Wednesday at the eastbound I-90 rest area between Billings and Hardin.
Searchers have been looking for Not Afraid since New Year's Day.
Radio check. Radio check.
Selena Not Afraid disappeared from a rest stop on New Year's Day in Montana's Big. It's been really cold. 9 days later, and community-led search teams were still looking for the first clue that might lead them to her.
So we know our mission for today. We're looking for any sign of Selena, anything out of the ordinary. You know the drill. You guys been doing it, so.
This is Beartooth.
Beartooth,
Yeah.
how are you, buddy? Let's find our girl.
Okay. Selena Not Afraid's case is an example of what Native women face. They are almost 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence compared to white women. And homicide is the 4th leading cause of death for those under 20. And the problems often continue even after death. According to a 2019 report, approximately half of all cases involving murdered Indigenous women in Montana have been misclassified for causes like suicide, overdose, or exposure.
Been on Bugsy, Teddy and his wife, their baby Little Eye, Mikey Plainbowl, Garrett, our current active search right now, Hub Williamson. Bonnie Three Arms, 2017, we recovered her. The next one was Henny Scott. Last year we recovered her. Sarah stops at pretty places. She was found, I believe, by a deputy in town in somebody's yard. And now our recent active search is Selena. In all the previous cases that I've been involved with, where the situation is like this here, it's always been a recovery. It's never been a happy ending.
Where is Selena? Where is she? Where's my grandbaby? Native Americans make up 6.7% of Montana's population, but account for 26% of missing person reports. And while local officials claim that causes for these deaths and disappearances are varied, from drug trafficking to domestic violence, the one thing they all have in common is that they take place in a jurisdictional minefield. Depending on where someone is reported missing or where a victim is found, it could fall to either state, federal, or tribal authorities to investigate. And with that many intersecting agencies, there are plenty of cracks for these cases to fall through.
An Indian reservation, for all intents and purposes, is a sovereign nation. It is subject to completely different laws, governing bodies. They're like a country within a country. So a Bighorn County deputy can show up on a tribal member's doorstep on the reservation, and that tribal member can say, you have no right to be here, you have no jurisdiction here. It can be very difficult.
Responsibility might fall with the county sheriff's department, officers from the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the tribal police. Sometimes the FBI also steps in. There are both too many agencies jockeying for authority and not enough resources to go around. In late 2019, the Crow tribe declared a state of emergency. Tribal Chairman A.J. Not Afraid cited a list of issues, including the BIA's lack of officers and failure to address the murdered and missing women crisis. The Crow Reservation is roughly the size of Connecticut, but for years has only had 5 BIA officers. Recently, the tribe assembled its own sovereign police force, independent from the BIA.
We're between two communities right now. We currently have no radio service. We have no cell phone service. We have no way that, unless we had a sat phone, we wouldn't have any way to communicate with anybody. And that contributes. It's very wide open. It's very desolate out here. The I-90 corridor, anybody that's going to Denver, going to South Dakota, trying to get to the West Coast, it all travels right through here for the most part. So we get a lot of drug trafficking out on the interstate. And, you know, with the crime, the drugs, the domestic violence, it's all a perfect breeding ground for people to go missing.
So we're gonna go ahead, everybody, to acknowledge all of the families who are here.
In downtown Hardin, a rally for the movement shows that Selena Not Afraid's disappearance is painfully familiar. Families gather to push for answers on their loved ones' suspicious deaths.
Why is it that we are more likely to be raped and murdered than go to college? Why is it that our young girls are just trying to survive? And so there are alarm bells that are ringing. What is going on?
The sheer number of Indigenous women that have been missing or murdered suggests an epidemic, but there isn't a comprehensive data set to confirm it. Desi Rodriguez Longmire, a sociologist who researches data in the Indigenous communities, is working to quantify the sweep of the problem.
All right. Okay, Sarah, stats, pretty places.
Tribes need to be building their own data sets. Our data systems have been erased and destroyed over centuries of colonization. We have so many cases where our women are being misclassified racially as white, as black, as Asian, as Latina, and not actually American Indian, and certainly not as citizens of different nations.
I know every single one of you here have not had justice for your loved one.
When I reported her missing, nobody helped me. The only response was, maybe she's drinking somewhere. What does that say to our people?
They said Henny was just one of those crazy little girls that would take off. So what?
We would never accept this. If, for example, these young girls were non-Indian, but yet here in southeastern Montana, we've accepted that negligence is okay. What is happening with all of these systems that are supposed to be in place to keep people safe?
Rodriguez Lone Bear knows this issue firsthand. Her own niece disappeared in August of 2019.
Sarah was last seen alive here in Hardin. She was at a house party with some friends, cousins. It was the summer she turned 18.
Family, friends, and members of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Group held the Justice March for Sarah Stops Pretty Places, whose body was found in Hardin on August 29.
After 5 days, a body was found. She was basically a Jane Doe here in the Bighorn County morgue for days. Finally, the medical examiner in Billings did a dental match, was able to determine that it was her. And so now here we are, 6 months later. Her cause of death has now been declared officially as undetermined. There are no leads.
When it comes to inconsistent investigations and lack of information, Rodriguez Lone Bear isn't alone. Many families have been waiting to get answers for years.
My daughter, Allison Highwolf, today would be her 5th year of passing away.
Highwolf was found dead in a motel room in Hardin. There are no leads in her case either.
The IA officer had told us that we couldn't go see her, that she was already in a morgue. He didn't give me very much information, just the fact that there was a motel fire and she was there by herself. And they determined smoke inhalation and undetermined. I feel deeply in my heart that she was murdered, that my daughter was murdered. It's not recognized by the Sheriff's Department in Hardin, Montana. We ask questions and they've never been answered.
Tonight, the search for Selena Not Afraid has come to a sad end. Her body discovered less than a mile away from where she disappeared.
Why was she not found sooner? Well, authorities in the area say that this place is big country and things can go unnoticed.
Somehow, this young woman, who is otherwise healthy, turns up dead in a sagebrush on her own accord. Maybe there's nobody that we can get for murder, but there is something that led to this young woman, to her dying and her body being found on the side of the road in a sagebrush.
If the tribe is able to take back over its law enforcement, increase its numbers, and do a better job of taking care of its own, of the reservation, I believe that it'll have an immediate impact on making things better.
There's also been national recognition of the problem. In October, President Trump signed 2 bills into law: the Non-Invisible Act and Savannah's Act, named for Savannah LaFontaine Graywin, a 22-year-old Spirit Lake Nation who was found murdered in 2017. The laws direct the Department of Justice to create more coordinated law enforcement and data collection in response to missing Indigenous persons.
We want to respect tribal sovereignty and the tribe's ability to maintain their authority and their public safety structure the way they'd like to maintain it. But it also adds complication. And so what we need to do, and what's being done at the national level, would be to try to figure out ways that even though we have different jurisdictions involved, to be sure they work together more fluidly and more seamlessly so that responses can come quicker and can hopefully be more effective.
We are so used to our people's deaths being classified as exposure, suicide, accidents, and not actually being investigated as suspicious. There's something happening here.
All right. Any thoughts? Questions? Is it a new issue? Most of you familiar with it? Any feedback? No, I've been talking for a long time. This is your opportunity to talk. No? Well, we know, for example, we talked about this last time, that Native Americans, especially their communities, are very under-resourced or have very high rates of poverty. They're socially isolated, right, or excuse me, physically isolated. A lot of their communities are in areas that are very rural. Any other thoughts? Yeah, that is a good thing. But there can also be other issues that come into play, jurisdictional issues, where that idea that or fact that Native American communities are sovereign places, it kind of restricts any cooperation between tribal police and either federal agencies or state and county agencies. And one of the issues that emerges is if I go on to a Native American community and I victimize a Native American resident. Tribal police can't touch me. Right? They can't arrest me. They can detain me. They can do an investigation, and they can call up the county police, who does have the authority to arrest me. They can call them up, but only the county police can arrest me, not tribal police, because I'm not a Native American citizen or not a Native American resident of that community. So there's no jurisdictional that come into play that really kind of tie the hands of both tribal police and county police. And on the flip side, if you're a tribal member and you commit a crime on tribal land, county police cannot come in and arrest you. Right? So there's some jurisdictional issues that come into play that cause issues like this. And also think about it recently where a lot of these Native American communities up north in the Dakotas, they become like prime real estate for oil and natural gas. So you have a lot of people who are non-Native American moving to those lands and maybe coming into contact with Native Americans, maybe victimizing Native Americans, and these jurisdictional issues come up. There's a movie, I don't know if y'all seen it, called Wind River, that kind of talks briefly about this, the jurisdictional issues that come into play. I'm not going to say it's a good movie, but there's a violent scene that I just can't watch over and over, like watch it once and I'm done. So I'm not going to recommend it, but if you've ever seen it, that's kind of a movie that highlights some of these issues. Okay, so I know I've been talking for a long time. I appreciate your cooperation. I was going to take attendance today, but I'm not going to do it today. I'm doing a position. And so collectively, we didn't make a lot of money. But we were like, I'm going to be in grad school for about 6 years. I want to invest in a house, buy a house. And then maybe eventually I could turn it into a profit. We couldn't afford a lot of money, or we couldn't afford a lot of house, and we bought a house in a low-income community with higher rates of violence, higher rates of crime than the city of Tallahassee, where I was living, had on average. And I remember one time I had this neighbor who was always getting into trouble, and I used kind of like this intuition to do something, like it's just some action, right? And so I just remember just being in my office at home, and I had this like intuition to look outside the window. And so I look out my window, and all of a sudden I see this car come by, park in front of my house, go over to the neighbor's house, who the neighbor was outside. It was just like pistol whipping. I've never seen anything like that before. Um, and I was like thinking of life. I just backed up. Right? Once I saw the pistol whip, I just backed up. Like I'm not gonna look anymore. Um, the neighbor, whose name was Jesse. Jesse was fine, right? Jesse got beat up a little bit, but he didn't die. And my whole thing was, what? Jesse's alive. He knows who did it, and I'll leave it up to Jesse to report that. I'm not going to say anything; it's not my business, right? I'm not involved, and so that's probably the most violent thing that I've ever seen from a witness standpoint. And I didn't call the police because I'm not getting involved. It didn't involve me. Jesse's fine. He's alive. Well, he wasn't fine. He had a black eye, but he was still living. He could speak. He could talk to the police if he wanted. And the guy who ended up with like pistol whipping him, So he kind of like lived in the neighborhood too. I recognized his truck. He lived in what was a dope house in the community. Don't know it was a dope house for sure. It just looks like a dope house. Never went inside to verify, but it was. You could tell, things like that were going on at that particular house in the neighborhood. So that's another possible explanation for this: is that people just stop their business, right? They're not going to get involved. Yeah.
Could it go into as well, like maybe you might do more harm than good by getting the police involved? Like you don't know the situation, you don't know what's going on. It might cause like, your neighbor Jesse more problems by getting the police involved.
For me or for the
Like as a witness, for you to call on a situation you don't know anything about, like you're just seeing the violence, like it can cause more problems.
Hey, Jesse was always getting into trouble, and I hate to say this, but Jesse probably deserved it. But he was like always asking people for money, and I would give him money just so he would go away, just so like he wouldn't bother me. Because every time he would ask me for more money, I'd be like, man, I already gave you some. So, but like living in a neighborhood like that where violence is pretty rampant around you, it's not very comfortable living there. I know, like growing up, I was never around guns. My father didn't own a gun. But when I lived in that neighborhood, I owned a gun, right? So it's not always that more guns cause crime. It's also the opposite can occur, right? When more crime causes people to get a gun for protection. But in that instance, I'm pretty sure Jesse didn't call the police because he feared retaliation. If this guy just whipped him with the guns, then what is he going to do the next time? We know that Jesse called the police. And then there was also another friend with him who wasn't hurt in the incident, and so that friend was there, and I was just like, that's fine. There's two living people there that can call the police, tell them what happened, know who the person is, and so I didn't even tell my neighbors. Like other neighbors didn't tell my neighbors that I physically saw what happened. Just because I was like, I don't want to get involved. So that happens sometimes too. But anyway, going to the next part of this slide. Both the UCR and NCBS, and I'll show you a couple of graphs here in a minute. What they show is that over time, or since the early 1990s, crime has been going down. Okay, so crime, especially violent crime, since the 1990s, has been going down as a trend. Yes, there's some year-to-year fluctuations, like we saw in 2020, where there was an increase in crime. But overall, the shifts in crime have been going down since the 1990s. So here's a graph from the NCPS that looks at non-reporting among various crimes. So the percentages here, what they reflect, is the percentage of crimes that are reported to the police. So you'll see here, the lowest one, rape or sexual assault, at 23%. What are some reasons for this one? Rape or sexual assault. Why is it so underreported? And I know some of y'all mentioned these reasons.
Usually somebody you know.
Usually somebody you know. Yes, that's one for sure. All right, typically there's some established relationship between the offender and the victim. It's another one. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So they're afraid like they won't be believed or that that person's more powerful than they are.
Yeah, which kind of goes off the previous point, right? If it's a crime where, especially if it's two adults, right, and they have some known established relationship, if they're like friends, for example, if one person says this was a rape or sexual assault, and the other person says it was consensual, it's very hard to prove one or the other's case. It can be very hard. Now, if it's a random person, right, now that's easier to prove, right, if you know who the suspect is. Okay. Any other reasons? Yes.
The victim is a minor, so they don't really know how to go about reporting.
Yeah. The victim's a minor and doesn't really know how to report the crime. Especially maybe if the offender is a family member or a friend of the family, right? Maybe that victim doesn't think that her parents or his parents would believe him or her. Anything else? Yeah.
We just want the situation to be over and don't have to revisit it.
Yeah, the trauma effect, right? You just want the situation to be done, don't want to relive it. Okay? There's maybe one more I can think of. Yeah.
Like they just don't want to be embarrassed. Like I know that a lot of male rape cases don't get reported because like the most don't want to get that. I guess
Yeah. That's a good one. I wasn't thinking about that one, but that's a very reasonable one, and it does happen, right? Males don't want to report it because they're embarrassed. Then probably the last one, someone said it earlier, is that they probably blame themselves, right? They blame themselves for this situation, for why it occurred. And so we have all these reasons, good reasons, that indicate why rape or sexual assault is widely underreported. Right? These are all logical reasons why we see this happen. Now, on the flip side, motor vehicle thefts, nearly 80%, which I think is a little bit lower than I would think, but 80% most widely reported crime, according to the NCPS. What's the reason for that? There's one logical one.
Because we need those things.
We need those things. But when your car is stolen, what do you usually call? Insurance or the police, right? But it's always going to be the police because if you want some insurance payout, they want to see a police report, right? They're not going to give you anything, no monetary compensation without a police report. So that's the reason why we see nearly 80% of motor vehicle thefts be reported to the police. Again, this is the NCBS. Of course, a homicide or murder is going to be much higher. Nearly 100% of cases are going to be, murder cases are going to be reported to the police simply because if someone goes missing or if there's a dead body, right, that's not something that's commonplace. So people call the police in those instances. But because this is just the NCBS, and then the NCBS doesn't ask about homicide, that's why you don't see it. But overall, murder or homicide would be the most widely reported. Okay. Some limitations of the NCBS. Oh, and before I go over these, one important piece that I forgot to mention about the NCBS is that with the NCBS, we're asking people to talk about prior victimization they've experienced, right? So whenever they're talking about these incidents and they're listing them down to the interviewer, the last question after talking about these incidents is always, was this crime reported to the police? So that's how we get to know which crimes were and were not reported. It's simply after the survey or after they talk about the specific victimization, they're asked whether or not they reported. But in terms of limitation, because this is a household survey, we don't get any information about commercial crimes such as banks or convenience store robbery. Also, no information about white-collar crimes, kidnappings, or homicide. And so for some specific crimes, the NCBS is not a very good indicator of crime or victimization. Right? Because it doesn't ask about these types of crimes. Also, probably one of the most prominent limitations is that because this is a household survey, what the groups of people that tend to be missed are those who are homeless or who have an unstable living situation, which is very important because research shows that among these populations, right, people who are homeless or living in an unstable living environment, right, they're moving to place. These groups of people tend to have higher rates of victimization than the general public. Right? Some high-risk people, in terms of victimization, are not being captured or included in the survey. Some other issues is that some people simply forget, right? They can't remember all the victimizations that have occurred to them. And we're just talking about a relatively short window. We're talking about within the last 6 months. Right? Some people just simply forget about one particular incident or one particular crime that they experienced within the last 6 months. There's also something called the phenomenon of telescoping. This is an issue with survey research. So the NCDF asks people to disclose victimizations that happened to them within the last 6 months, right? So in the last 6 months, have any of these things happened to you? Well, sometimes people have a hard time remembering whether or not a particular incident happened to them 8 months ago versus maybe 5 months ago, right? So if that incident really occurred 8 months ago, but you're saying it happened 5 months ago, what you're doing is you're inadvertently including that crime in the survey, right? Just because you can't simply remember when exactly this crime occurred to you. It's a telescoping. This is the definition. That reporting a crime that is outside the scope of the survey. And for the NCBS, the scope is going to be the last 6 months. Over time, scholars use both UCR statistics and NCBS data to examine rates of both criminal offending or arrest and victimization among different racial and ethnic groups. And what they both reveal, both the UCR and NCBS, is that yes, among arrests and among victimization, we see higher rates of minority crime and victimization. So a question we talked about earlier this week is whether or not that's evidence of differential offending, right? Are minorities really engaging in more crime? Or are they being disproportionately punished for these offenses? Right, so something to consider. So here's the trends in crime over time. So this is arrest rates. So as you see here, when we're accounting for differences in the population, we're looking at rates. Is that over time, since 1990 to 2019, arrests in the U.S. have gone down. So crime, according to UCR, is going down. Now let's look at the next one. This is the NCBF. This is all violent victimizations, followed by violent victimizations that are reported to the police. As we see here too, even with this, there's a downward decline. They're never going to be the same, right? The UCR and the NCBS are never going to be the same in terms of measuring the same amount of crimes, simply because with the UCR, most crimes are not reported to the police. But as you see, both of them here, what they show and what they're confirming is that over time, or at least since the 1990s, we've seen a drop in crimes occurring in the United States. So here's the third and final crime data tool. And this is known as self-report study. Now, the difference between self-report studies and the ECR and victimization survey is that there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of different types of self-report studies. This is one example here. It's called the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, or AdHealth for short. So this survey asks kids who are now grown-ups questions about their involvement in crime and delinquency, their educational attainment over time, their social life, whether or not they got married, had kids, and even ask questions about like various types of behaviors, including like sexual behaviors. It's a really in-depth survey that's used in a lot of fields. In criminology, we use it a lot, but other fields use it as well. But this survey itself started first in 1994 and 1995, and is still continuing up to this day. Right? And they're surveying the same people over time. So the people who were initially surveyed in 1994 and 1995 are now being followed up, and we're still asking them questions. And then even in wave 3 or survey 3, we ask questions to their partners, right, romantic partners. So a lot of variation. But self-report study are going to focus on your previous criminal behavior, right? So whereas victimization survey asked about crimes you've been a victim of, here we're interested in people who have committed crimes, right? What crimes have you committed in the past? And notice we always ask about previous criminal behavior. We don't want to know what you're going to do in the future, because that can hold researchers liable. But as long as you tell me what you've done in the past, even if that was like a side, I'm protected from not having to tell anyone. We don't ask questions about prior homicide most of the time because people are probably going to lie about that. But it's also a relatively rare phenomenon to talk about homicide. But either way, we're always focused on previous criminal behavior. In some report studies, they're actually quite old, so they're older than the NCDS. And as early as the 1930s, there were some questions about whether or not the UTR was biased, right? Whether or not police officers are more likely to arrest people of certain races. So in 1950, the self-report studies were a way to try to alleviate the supposed police bias. And here's what we typically find with self-report studies. So self-report studies are typically going to overrepresent minor offenses. Right? Think about juvenile delinquent acts. Right? Things like graffiti, or maybe stealing some minor item from a grocery store. Very rarely do we ask about serious and violent. Right? So the self-report studies are very good at getting at prior criminal behavior, but mainly if those are relatively minor offenses, not serious crimes. But perhaps the most notable finding is this, the bottom one, is that when it comes to drug use, self-report studies show that whites, blacks, and even Hispanics use drugs at similar rates. So with drug use, the biggest finding that's come out of self-report studies is that racists use drugs at similar rates. Which is problematic, right, given that in the 80s and 90s, we had a whole war on drugs that disproportionately focused on eradicating drugs and drug use in inner city communities. This is probably the biggest takeaway finding from self-report studies in respect to race and ethnicity. Just be focused a little bit here, talking about hate crimes. Now, hate crimes themselves are actually tracked by both the UCR, or now NIBRS, as well as the NCBS. So both NCBS and UCR actually track hate crime. Now, how we define hate crime has changed over time, right? Just like how we define race has changed, or how many racial categories we have has changed. So has the different types of hate crime. So initially, right, we started off with hate crimes focusing on race and religion. And since then, it's expanding to include things like ethnicity, sexual orientation. I think even now, like gender and gender identity is tracked or considered a hate crime. It's a really expansive list as time goes on. But the one that's most common when we talk about hate crime trends is hate crimes pertaining to race. So racial biases, right, are most often anti-black biases, tend to be the most common types of hate crime. I'll go back to the slide. So this is hate crimes recorded, total number of hate crimes recorded in the last 5 years. So in total, we have over 46,000 hate crimes that are reported by law enforcement agencies. And this is from the UCR, the FBI. So as you see here, most of the hate crimes that are reported to the police tend to focus on race or ethnicity. And then after that, it's going to be religion, followed by sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and then gender identity. And the number of hate crimes that are recorded each year are often driven by social events, right? So I can think of, the last year or two, because of the war in Israel with Hamas, that there's probably a lot of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish hate crimes that have emerged over the last couple of years. And the one we'll talk about here in a minute is there's been an uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes, particularly around the pandemic. All right, so a lot of these hate crimes, specific bias categories, some of them you'll see an uptick based on social events, what's happening in the world. But like other types of crime, hate crimes are widely underreported. And here's some of the reasons why. So, like other types of crime, police agencies themselves are not required to report hate crimes to the FBI. So the 46,000 figure we just showed is going to be an undercount. Also, which is a very real phenomenon, a lot of victims of hate crimes don't report these incidents to the police. And finally, it's very hard for police to label something as a hate crime. And the reason being is it's really hard to prove that this aggravated assault was motivated by bias or some type of hate based on this person's gender, their race, or their religion. Right? So it's hard differentiating between, I don't want to say typical aggravated assault, but an aggravated assault that's motivated by one of these hate bias categories. So it's very difficult for police to prove. other crime, where most crimes involving a victim and offender, they tend to share the same race, right? They're intraracial. In terms of hate crime, majority are interracial, with most oftentimes the offender being white. And as you saw with the previous statistics, right, the most common type of hate crime are hate crimes that are directed against one's race or ethnicity. And then with the rise of COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021, we saw a substantial uptick, more than a double percentage rise in hate crimes directed against Asian and Asian Americans. There's two important findings with that. So first, we know that anti-Asian hate crimes in 2020 and 2021 were a historic uptick. Right? We knew for a fact that historically there had never been as much anti-Asian hate crime reported during that 1 year than in other previous years. Okay? So in 2021, we saw an historic increase, high point for anti-Asian hate crime. But what research has also shown through self-report studies and from the NCBS is that many of these incidents, even though there was already a historic high, a lot of them were not reported to the police. So what we saw from the FBI, we talk about how it was a historic high. You know that there was a lot of them that were still not reported to the police. Right? So it's a historic high, but still widely underreported. Okay. So last topic we're going to discuss is the role of immigration in crime. So some of you have already heard me talk about this issue. Right? I have a course on immigration and crime that I also teach during some semesters. But it's a notable issue, right? This year. But the notion or topic of immigration and crime, a lot of it's traced back to the early 1900s. So early 1900s, when we started collecting crime data, as we saw with the Census Bureau, right? Census Bureau also collected crime data by immigrant status. In the early 1900s, a lot of this research was focused on the supposed high criminal involvement of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. So a lot of these groups that were arriving in the early 1900s, whether they were Italian, they were Russian, they were Polish, they were Greek, they were very different from the European immigrants we had seen previously, right? Mainly emanating from Germany and Ireland. These groups were different, right? Different culturally, they spoke different languages, and many argued they had higher rates of criminal activity. So the hot button issue in the early 1900s, and in 1931, there was this wide-scale study called the Wickersham Commission that looked at European immigrants' involvement in crime. And just to summarize what they found, this was Edith Abbott, who was one of the, what do you say? She was on the Wickersham Commission. She was doing investigations on the role of immigration and crime. She was also a social worker in the University of Chicago in the early 1900s. And here's what she says about the Wickersham Commission and the role of immigration and crime. She says, for more than a century, there has been continuously in this country a clamorous, which means loud, group who have tended to emphasize only the difficulties connected with immigration and to lose sight of all its beneficial effects. Unfortunately, these attacks on the alien have frequently laid stress on the popularly supposed relation between immigration and crime. Statistics have never justified their assumptions. So what the Wickersham Committee found was that overall immigrants actually had lower rates of crime than the native born. And what they also found was that children of immigrants had very high rates of crime, much higher than their foreign-born parents. But after the 1930s, we saw a significant drop in immigration to the U.S. I remember previously we talked about the Quota Acts of 1921, 1924. From the 1930s up until about the 60s and 70s, immigration to the U.S. was very, very low. But since this time, we've seen a significant increase in immigration, right? So since 1970, we've seen substantial increases in immigration. And unlike previously, where most immigrants came from Europe, today the majority of immigrants either come from Latin America or Asia. So even though the racial and ethnic population of immigrants has changed today, we still find similar results than those observed in the Wickersham Commission. Is that first generation immigrants with a foreign born have about 45% lower likelihood of committing or engaging in violence than, say, the third generation Americans. Right? So third generation will constitute the grandchildren of an immigrant. And we find that true in various studies, right? This is not just one study, right? There's been many, many studies that have confirmed this result. And what we also found is that as America has experienced more and more immigration, we've seen violent crime drop in the U.S. So just to give you an example, from 1990 to 2012, number of immigrants in the U.S. doubled from 20 million in 1990 to over 40 million in 2012. But during that time period, violent crime rates dropped significantly. Now, sure you learned this in your research methods class, but correlation doesn't equal causation, right? That's definitely true. We can't say that this drop in crime is due to increases in immigration. We can't prove that. Well, what we can prove is that violence is not increasing as a result of immigration. Of course, this is a race and ethnicity file. We're talking about race and ethnicity in the context of crime. So for immigrants, we see similar observation where there's racial and ethnic differences among the foreign-born in terms of their involvement in crime. So this graph here is looking at incarceration rates for males for those ages 18 to 39 in 2000. And as we see here, the black bars represent the native born, the blue bars represent immigrant groups. So across all races and ethnicities, look here, we see lower incarceration rates for immigrants relative to the native born, but still see some racial and ethnic difference. Looking at it in depth, right? Just looking at Latinos, looking at nationality groups, we see that among the foreign-born, those from Mexico and El Salvador and Guatemala actually have the lowest rates of incarceration rate relative to other nationalities. But look at the effect with a native born of Mexican, Salvadorian, and Guatemalan descent, right? Even though their parents might have low rates of incarceration, low rates of crime, among the second generation or other native born people who share these heritages, their rates of incarceration are substantially higher. They increase a great amount. This is the effects for Asians. So we're looking at Asians and their incarceration rates. They have the lowest incarceration rate of all groups. But even here, you see some substantial variation across nationality. With those of Vietnamese and Laotian and Cambodian descent have higher rates of incarceration. But the next question is, who cares, right? I'm not worried about immigrant. I'm worried about undocumented immigrant. Those are the ones I fear. Those are the ones who you read about in news, associated with high-profile incidents, is undocumented immigrant. The unfortunate answer to that question is it's very hard to evaluate involvement in crime among undocumented immigrants simply because we lack information on legal status. Right? We know from the UCR and even the NCDS, they do a poor job of measuring just race and ethnicity. So these other data tools don't even collect data on legal status. Right? Legal status is very, very hard to confirm. And of course, if you're collecting it through self-reports, most people might say, yeah, I'm documented or I'm legally bound to be here, right? I have legal documentation to be here. So it's really hard to track data on legal status. But in research, what we say is that when you talk about an undocumented immigrant, what that typically looks like, how that person looks like, they're typically very young, they're typically males, relatively females. They tend to have very low rates of education and tend to be unmarried. Now, in general, these profiles here, right, these characteristics, on average, fit the profile of your average offender. So in terms of their profile, right, the average profile of an undocumented person, they tend to have a profile of people who are involved in criminal justice. But fortunately, there's one state that does collect this information, and that's Texas. Right. I think California is collecting it now, but Texas does collect information about legal status for arrestees. So in Texas alone, what we see is that across these crime types here, undocumented immigrants, again, this is just Texas and this is just arrests, undocumented immigrants have lower rates of arrests for homicide, assault, sexual assault, burglary, and arson. And also from these data here, even for the undocumented person, right? We can't just always assume that this is a person who just crossed the border illegally, right? Maybe this was someone who came over as a child and grew up here, right? Those persons, right, who came over as a child and didn't have legal status would still be counted as an undocumented person. The last slide. So as everything we've talked about today, we still use UCR and NCDS, self-report studies, to look at racial and ethnic differences in crime and victimization. Studies have shown both historically and presently that immigrants tend to engage in less crime relative to the native born. But one finding to take away from here is that both UCR and NCDS find that racial minorities, especially blacks and Hispanics, engage in more crime than whites. Right? We know that that's true. That's a real phenomenon. But the question is, or how we should interpret it, is that race is causally related to offending. Right? We can't make that assumption because we know that racial and ethnic groups grow up in different communities, they have different education levels, they have differences in exposures to violence, things like that, involvement in the criminal justice system. So it's really hard to make the argument that race itself causes crime, because race is going to be correlated with other factors that we know that are linked to criminal behavior. All right, did better this time around.